Berlin, 2nd of March, 1945. The city breathes smoke and fire. Below, ruins shimmer behind a haze of anti-aircraft bursts. Above, thin sunlight cuts through the overcast. Every second, the roar of dozens of Merlin engines trembles in the frozen air. Captain William T Whisner's P-51D Mustang slices through that sky. Flaps tucked, throttle pinned, a canopy flecked with ice. His oxygen mask crackles with static as he scans upward. Then spots them. Specks against the light. The last defense of a dying Reich. Messerschmitt, Me-262. Jets, silver streaks from the west, climbing to intercept the American bombers. Most pilots would dive to the deck, trade altitude for speed. Whisner does the opposite. He hauls the nose up, climbing straight into thin air and almost certain death. Gauges shake, manifold pressure screaming, G-forces crushing the seat beneath him. 40,000 feet over Berlin, his Mustang begins its impossible climb. The kind of maneuver no manual endorsed and no instructor predicted would work. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Europe had become both a triumph of engineering and a theater of attrition. The Allies had gained mastery of the skies, yet every mile toward Berlin meant fighting for that control once again. The 8th Air Force, operating from airfields across England, sent hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into the heart of Germany. Their mission was precise and merciless. Dismantle the Reich's capacity to fight, one factory, bridge, and marshalling yard at a time. But even at that late hour, the Luftwaffe still struck back with ferocity. Jet squadrons scrambled from bases around Brandenburg and the Harz Hills. Battle-hardened veterans flew alongside teenage replacements in aircraft built from the last of Germany's dwindling materials. Anti-aircraft crews manned batteries that had become part of Berlin's daily heartbeat. Their thumps echoed through the city like a mechanical pulse, a grim rhythm of survival. For the bomber crews, survival depended on their guardians, the long-range fighters. At the start of the war, American bombers had flown without them beyond the Rhine, with disastrous results. But the introduction of the North American P-51 Mustang had changed everything. Its Rolls-Royce-designed Merlin engine, excellent, high-altitude performance, and belly tank range made it the escort the heavy bombers had prayed for. The fighter could accompany them all the way to Berlin and back to England. An unthinkable range just a year earlier. The pilots who flew these Mustangs were a new breed of airmen. Young, capable, methodical, often barely past 20, yet trained to fight at altitudes where the air itself could kill. Among them was Captain William T Whisner of the 352nd Fighter Group. The blue-nosed bastards of Bodney, named for the distinct cobalt paint that wrapped their engine cowls. Based at RAF Bodney in Norfolk, the group had earned a fearsome reputation protecting bombers and hunting enemy interceptors across northern Europe. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's situation was desperate. Its fuel stocks were nearly exhausted, while Allied raids pounded the remaining production centers. Yet desperation breeds audacity. Germany's new weapon, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet, could outrun anything the Allies had in level flight. Designed to climb faster, attack from superior altitude, and disengage at will, it threatened to unravel Allied air superiority at the very doorstep of victory. The Allied solution wasn't technology. It was courage, multiplied by tactical brilliance, turning piston fighters into predators that could catch jets under the right conditions. Whisner, leading flights of the 352nd that March morning, knew the new threat intimately. His unit had already faced Me-262s near Magdeburg weeks before, losing comrades who had never even seen their attackers clearly. The group's commander, Kollew, John C. Meyer had briefed them clearly. The jets were fast but vulnerable during takeoff and climb. Intercept them above the bombers and you'd be swarmed. Catch them climbing or landing, and luck might finally turn. At dawn on 2nd March, Allied intelligence indicated heavy defenses around Berlin. Weather forecasts showed a broken ceiling with high cirrus. The 352nd's orders were to escort the bomber streams aimed at destroying rail yards saturating the capital's transport system, a mission that would finally cripple movement to the Eastern Front, where the Red Army pressed in from the Oder. They would take off early, rendezvous en route, and remain over Berlin only for the critical phase, then peel away to hunt any interceptors that survived the assault. By 10 p.m., contrails, white scars in the blue-gray sky, began forming across northern Germany. The radio net crackled with position calls. 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe tracked hundreds of dots moving toward the heart of the Reich. Somewhere below that immense mosaic of formations, civilians went on with their brittle, normal routines, aware that the deep, growing hum above was not thunder. Whisner's squadron climbed through 20,000 feet, engine gauges glowing amber in the morning light. Each pilot watched the outer wings of his neighbor shimmer under light turbulence. Fuel check. Gun switches armed. The Mustang's cockpit was cramped, its plexiglass canopy already frosting, but every control was placed with the ruthless precision of purpose-built machinery. They were escorting death and defying it at the same time. The Berlin raid would test bomber crews, anti-air batteries, and one pilot who refused to stop climbing. At that altitude, clarity became danger's mirror. The morning of 2nd March 1945 began in a ritual of breath and frost at RAF Bodny. Maintenance crews in heavy parkas moved through lines of blue-nosed Mustangs, tapping propeller blades to loosen ice. Engine oil heaters hummed. Inside the briefing hut, cigarette smoke hung low as intelligence officers pointed at maps of northern Germany. Thick red arrows marked the bomber routes into Berlin. Smaller green curves showed estimated interception tracks of the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 7, the first fully jet-equipped German fighter wing. Captain William T Whisner remembered what those arcs meant. 2 weeks earlier, his group had seen an Me-262 slice a B-17 clean in half near Magdeburg. Nobody in his flight had even drawn a bead before the jet vanished, contrails spiraling in its wake. The message was plain: survive by tactics, not technology. At 0830 hours, the 352nd Fighter Group rolled down Bodny's long strip under a thin sheet of low morning fog. Each takeoff passed in thunder and smoke, or, as one crew chief later wrote, 50 blue noses biting through frost. Whisner lifted his Mustang, Moonbeam McSwine, into a climb. Throttle open to 61 inches of manifold pressure. The sky above the North Sea shimmered with the condensation of hundreds of engines. Beneath, England shrank into mist. Crossing the Dutch coast meant entering enemy radar coverage. German controllers at Doberitz detected the vast formation and alerted nearby airfields. Fuel scarcity had grounded many piston squadrons, but jet bases still received priority deliveries from the Reich's dwindling synthetic fuel plants. By mid-morning, pilots of JG-7 were already strapping into their Me-262s at Brandenburg-Brest and Parchim, the howl of jet turbines echoing against shattered hangars. Above them, the bomber columns were enormous. More than 1,000 heavy aircraft, B-17s and B-24s, escorted by nearly 800 fighters. It was an entire nation's industrial capacity condensed into motion. The Mustang units rotated high cover every 45 minutes, each guarding the bombers through successive stages of the mission. Whisner's 352nd Group would remain near Berlin during the most hazardous window, when German interceptors typically lunged from below at maximum speed. As they neared central Germany, flak bursts began stitching the lower sky. Billowing ebony clouds rose around the bomber's stream, each flash accompanied by a metallic shudder through the formation. Over the intercom came clipped American radio chatter. Bandits at 11 high, possibly jets. Even without seeing them, the pilots sensed the change. Enemy attacks that once arrived head-on now struck with almost surgical precision, the jets booming through like artillery shells. The blue-nosed bastards climbed to escort level 30,000 feet. Oxygen masks hissed rhythmically. Frost crept along the inner cockpit rails. Whisner tested his gun heaters, vital at these temperatures, where frozen lubrication could jam an entire wing. He checked fuel again, main tank half full, external tanks still feeding. Enough for Berlin and perhaps a brief fight. Below lay a country in ruins, inventories of smoke, broken bridges, and snow dust fields. Yet for the defenders, this was the last gate to protect. Each 88mm flak battery around the capital had been resighted to defend against the high-altitude attacks, battering rail junctions and armament plants day after day. By 10:30 hours, with contrails stretching clear across the horizon, Whisner's flight reached the bomber stream as it approached the outer defenses of Berlin. German radar plotted the incoming wave with the resignation of arithmetic. 1,232 bombers, 732 fighters. Intercept order issued. Throttles forward! Moments later, spotters at Jüterbog reported the first jets lifting off. 8 aircraft climbing northeast toward the oncoming formation. Their acceleration tore dust from the runways and scattered snow like powder smoke. High above, the Mustang group began to descend into loose combat formations to screen the slow-moving bombers. Whisner's voice cut through radio static. Calm, tight, deliberate. Red flight. Check your 6. We're over the target area. Nobody yet realized that the next 3 minutes would enter both U.S. and German combat reports as one of the strangest pursuits of the war. A piston-engine Mustang clawing straight upward into the domain of jets, and winning. The impossible climb did not happen in isolation. To grasp what Whisner accomplished above Berlin, we have to understand the technical edge and the razor-thin limits of his machine. The P-51D Mustang represented the summit of piston-engine fighter evolution, an alloy that balanced power, efficiency, and aerodynamic grace in a way that had taken 5 hard years to perfect. Its heart was the Packard-built Merlin Bommy 1657. 12 cylinders, supercharged, delivering roughly 1,600 horsepower at altitude. The twin-stage, 2-speed supercharger allowed the engine to hold manifold pressure even as the air thinned, a vital feature at high elevations where German jets normally ruled. But horsepower alone could not counter a jet's raw speed. What gave the Mustang a fighting chance was its energy retention, the ability to trade altitude for velocity and back again with minimal drag penalty. In an environment where a split second of speed meant survival, that single aerodynamic gift turned brave men into mathematicians of instinct. Whisner's Mustang carried 75 gallons in each wing tank and an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the cockpit. Fully fueled, the aircraft could escort bombers on an almost 1,750-mile loop. But extra fuel meant extra weight. Pilots learned to burn the rear tank first. Once empty, the center of gravity shifted forward, sharpening maneuverability. By March 1945, crews like Whisner's had refined these small rituals into science. Shifting fuel loads flick by flick of a selector valve, balancing weight, drag, and risk. The Luftwaffe confronted a nightmare of arithmetic. The Me-262A1A could reach more than 540 miles per hour, a full 100 faster than Whisner's P-51 at level flight. Yet the jet's Junkers Jumo 004 engines were delicate. Throttling required slow transitions to avoid flameout, and fuel endurance did not exceed 30 minutes of combat. Each sortie was a sprint, Each climb had to be precisely timed with radar guidance to intercept Allied bombers before fuel or mechanical failure ended the fight. German aces who confronted Mustangs knew this imbalance bitterly. Reports recovered after the war described the 352nd by reputation. The blue noses follow their bombers like nails to magnet. When one dives, two more fall upon you from the sun. For the Luftwaffe, the Mustang symbolized American inexhaustibility. A machine that came in waves, disciplined, emotionless. To Allied flyers, though, every sortie felt personal. In March 1945, most had logged hundreds of hours above enemy territory. Nerves grew thin, reflexes automatic. Even minor turbulence could rattle hands already stiff from cold or fatigue. Yet exhaustion sharpened discipline. Bomber escorts flew in staggered boxes of 4, maintaining visual contact through the blinding glare of contrails. A moment's lapse and a jet could cut through unseen. The tactics Whisner used that morning came straight from that crucible of trial. He attacked not the strength of the Me-262, but its process, exploiting that narrow window when the jet accelerated or climbed. The moment a Me-262 banked upward, its thrust fell temporarily below weight, leaving a shallow parabolic climb vulnerable to high-energy interception. The Mustang, lighter and tighter, could whip around the bomber stream, build momentum in a gentle dive, then pull into the climb on the jet's tail using accumulated speed as stored energy. It was aerodynamics stripped bare to survival's essence. This was energy fighting elevated to art, a philosophy championed by men like John Boyd 2 decades later, but practiced instinctively by Allied aces long before theory named it. Speed was a bank account, altitude the balance sheet, spend one, earn the other. Yet the cold mathematical precision concealed a very human reality. Inside the P-51's small cockpit, at nearly 40,000 feet, temperatures sank below 40 degrees Celsius. Frost crept across dials. Breath froze inside oxygen masks. The noise was constant, a metallic thunder vibrating through bones. At full climb, every 7 seconds demanded a micro-adjustment of trim to counter torque. Every 10 seconds a glance at the coolant gauge, whose needle twitched dangerously near the red. For pilots in those final months, enemy fighters were just one threat. Mechanical failure, weather, or a glancing fragment of flak could snuff out even the most seasoned ace. By late 1944, German gunners were firing roughly 3 million rounds of flak ammunition to bring down one bomber, and every projectile exploding near the bombers could wound an escort as well. Whisner's calm tone over radio reflected the culture forged by repetition. Emotions compressed into checklist cadence. His squadron had lived in near-permanent readiness since D-Day, cycling between combat patrols, maintenance, and nights lying awake listening to engines of returning groups land in the darkness. The war had become a rhythm, and Berlin was its final verse. From the ground, German civilians looked up at contrails pulling straight lines through the sky, not knowing that those white scars represented both vengeance and protection. The 352nd and their sister groups were not merely fighting opponents. They were enacting the end of Hitler's promised air supremacy, dismantling it from above. Up there, in that balance of mechanics and instinct, Whisner prepared for a decision that textbooks said was foolish: to fight a jet in its own element by climbing to meet it. The data said impossible. Experience said the same. Only the man inside the blue-nosed Mustang thought otherwise. Whisner's flight over Berlin was also a study in leadership. Quiet, procedural leadership that replaced rhetoric with poise. In the 352nd, rank mattered less than judgment. A leader was a voice that did not shake when flak hammered and when oxygen hissed in the headset. Whisner's tone on the radio remained clear enough for men 13,000 feet below to draw steady breath. That was how leadership translated in the thin altitudes of war. Not through speeches, but through calm sentences that cut cleanly through static. He embodied a very American strain of mastery. Technical, analytical, dispassionate under fire. By 1945, Allied fighter doctrine had evolved into a hybrid of machine precision and individual choice. Pilots were drilled so that reaction became calculation. Yet at its heart lay moral stamina, the implicit duty to protect the bomber crews whose odds were worse than anyone's. More than 25,000 bomber personnel had already lost their lives over Europe. Escorting them was both duty and repayment. Their lives became the currency of conscience. From the Luftwaffe's perspective, the Americans were not just more numerous. They were relentless in the system of war. German pilots, once trained over years, were now lucky to receive a few dozen flight hours before combat. Their machines were faster, but their doctrine fragmented, split between the jet visionaries like Adolf Galland and the older school still clinging to defensive spirals. Jet pilots often described meeting Mustangs as swatting hornets, short strikes amid swarms of aircraft appearing from every cloud layer. Each engagement forced them into narrow decision windows: attack, break, climb. That fragmentation gradually eroded German cohesion and morale. Technical observers after the war noted another contrast. The P-51 cockpit layout, simple, logical, ergonomic before the word was fashionable, gave even exhausted pilots a sense of control. Switches lined up like sentences, gauges clustered where gloved hands would find them blindly. Inside an Me-262, the opposite was true. Half a dozen levers and warning lights competed for attention, each linked to a temperamental system that might flame out if touched at the wrong second. German pilots did not fear the Mustang's firepower as much as the discipline behind it, and there was discipline in seeing. American flyers had learned to read the sky not as scenery, but as geometry. Sun position, cloud thickness, the angle of contrail shadows, all cues to predict an enemy's next move. Whisner's choice to climb into that clear, blinding quadrant above Berlin was not impulse. It came from patient visual calculus. He recognized that the jet formation rising from Brandenburg was nearly nose-on with the bomber stream, which meant at least half of them would be momentarily blinded by sun glare. That second of blindness was his advantage. In this intersection of mental chess and physical risk lies the human angle. Each pilot carried a personal contradiction: claustrophobia inside an open sky, the isolation of being alone within meters of hundreds of others. Combat footage shows Mustangs looping and banking in immaculate choreography, but inside those cockpits were human hearts running on equal parts caffeine, adrenaline, and fatigue. Whisner's flight likely lasted just over 7 hours. 7 hours sitting on parachute straps and armor plating in sub-zero cold, breathing canned oxygen and the taste of rubber hose. The enemy was not only out there, it was also the body's own limits. The mission also illuminates moral dimensions often blurred by victory's glow. The bomber offensive that March killed thousands of civilians as well as soldiers. Nonetheless, for airmen like Whisner, the calculus was unambiguous: shorten the war, and fewer would die overall. Such reasoning let them focus on immediate survival without collapsing under guilt. Letters home reveal the tension, affection folded around understatement. Berlin again today. Sky a mess. We did our job, he wrote. The simplicity disguises the cost. To historians, the impossible climb later became proof of how technology had reached a threshold: human reflexes versus machines that already exceeded them. Within 5 years, jets would dominate. Propeller fighters would belong to museums. Yet in those final months of WWII, the P-51 still held the crown because it extended the endurance of the pilot himself. The machine was not yet faster than its master. Meanwhile, German ground observers who recorded that battle left notes tinged with astonishment. One American plane rose almost vertically and attacked the jet from behind, hitting it during climb. Unbelievable. Even amid collapse, they recognized courage when they saw it. War had become industrial, But bravery remained artisanal, handcrafted in moments like that. Thus, the angles of Whisner's mission converge. Tactical ingenuity, mechanical mastery, human resilience, and moral ambiguity. Each would crystallize in the next few minutes of flight, when a blue-nosed Mustang would pitch into the pale sun far above Berlin and prove that audacity, when paired with discipline, could still defy mathematics. At 10:45 a.m., altitude 31,000 feet, Whisner's headset filled with clipped radio calls. Bandits diving 10 o'clock. Jets in the sun. The air vibrated under scattered flak bursts. Through his canopy, he briefly saw silver arrows slicing past the bomber's stream. Mi-262s, twin-engine phantoms flashing gunfire that shredded air and sound alike. One B-17 in the second element plummeted, smoke trailing from its right wing. Parachutes opened far below. "Too fast. They're too fast," murmured a wingman over the net. The 352nd tightened formation. But Whisner spotted a mistake. One jet, gaining discipline, climbing directly through the bombers instead of past them, rolling into a broad upward curve in front of the sun. That movement exposed its weakest state. Transition, when both engines throttled up through a delicate balance of fuel and airflow. Instinct decided quicker than words. Whisner toggled the drop tank release. Two metal cylinders tumbled away, flashing silver as they dropped. The Mustang's weight felt lighter, freer. He opened the throttle to emergency boost, 67 inches of manifold pressure, and banked sharply left, blood pressing him into the harness. The altimeter wound upward. The climb began in silence, the kind of silence that comes when oxygen flow and heartbeat drown out the world. Below, the bomber stream receded like a moving map. His aircraft's nose bit the pale horizon. The Merlin engine howled into the thin air. At 37,000 feet, manifold pressure began to fade. He pushed past, accepting the risk of detonation, every vibration translating through the rudder pedals. Ahead, the Mi-262 seemed to hang motionless for a breath. Climbing, too, perhaps unaware that a single P-51 was following this high into the jet's private sky. German reports later suggest the jet pilot was Lieutenant Rudolf Ineichen of JG-7, making his third sortie of the day. His chrono showed less than 15 minutes of fuel. He had chosen altitude for safety. A jet that high could dive away untouched. He never expected anyone to come after him. At 38,000 feet, the Mustang felt like an exhausted swimmer. Airspeed fell toward 200 millitons. Propeller blades bit almost empty air. Every second the dial ticked lower, inviting a stall. Frost glimmered across the windscreen edges. Whisner's breath clouded inside his mask. He eased the pitch trim down, buying a few more knots. The Merlin vibrated in a rattling, uneven song. Then the sun fractured across the upper canopy. And suddenly, the Mi-262 filled the gun sight. Whisner steadied the stick, adjusted the gyro sight to 400 yards, and fired a half-second burst. The 6 50 caliber guns loosed a stream of tracer that curved upward in the rarefied air. The first burst fell short. The second reached the target. Impacts flashed across the jet's port engine. Smoke erupted instantly gray-white. Glycol. The Mi-262 yawed left, its climb ending in a spiral. At that altitude, even a small flame meant catastrophe. The heated vapor met thin oxygen and ignited. Ground observers later wrote of a small sun falling through clouds. Whisner rolled inverted and followed the burning aircraft down, watching it tumble past 25,000 feet before exploding in a sharp orange blink. His voice remained level on the radio. "Got one of the jets." Breaking off. There was no triumph, only report. The professional's dialect of survival. The feat defied both aerodynamics and precedent. In recorded combat of the European Air War, few piston engine fighters ever achieved a kill against a jet during a pure climb. Whisner had done it by using stored kinetic energy rather than sustained power. a maneuver akin to throwing one's entire body into a single upward punch, knowing gravity would reclaim it in seconds. The strain left the Mustang trembling. Cylinder head temperature climbed beyond redline. Oil pressure dipped. He leveled off, throttled back, searching for the bomber formation somewhere amid layers of smoke. Over Berlin, flak continued to burst in black chrysanthemums, petals of shrapnel unfolding across blue. The radio crackled with updates. Other pilots calling additional sightings, one reporting an Me-262 destroyed near Ketzen, another forced to belly land with holes in its radiator. The sky was a ledger of victory and loss written in vapor. From that moment, many witnesses below believed the American fighter had performed some impossible acrobatics. German reports described it as a nearly vertical pursuit which continued beyond expected limits. A polite military way of saying they couldn't explain it. Allied intelligence officers reading those same reports weeks later underlined the passage in pencil. High alt engagement, verify. Whisner himself never romanticized the climb. To him, it was simply geometry done fast. A triangle of speed and angle closing to a solution before fuel ran out. But for his comrades in the 352nd, it became legend overnight. The day a Mustang chased a jet into the stratosphere and won. As he rejoined formation, mainland Berlin spread beneath him, a patchwork of fires and snow. The bombers had unloaded their payloads. The Luftwaffe's remaining fighters were scattered, some grounded by lack of fuel, others circling with nowhere to land. Above that fading battlefield, one blue-nosed Mustang leveled out, its pilot breathing steadily while the gauges cooled back toward green. Whisner banked through a slow arc west of Berlin. The smoke rising from the last explosion drifted past his tail as new dots materialized on the horizon. Jets again, small as gnats, yet closing at extraordinary speed. They were coming from Rechlin, flying in twos, their exhaust trails cutting white slashes through the clear upper air. The 352nd Fighter Group scattered into defensive pairs. "Blue 2, cover my 6, a familiar voice crackled, steady after an hour of violence. Whisner pitched the Mustang's nose up once more, choosing altitude over speed, gambling that the next encounter would be brief. Fuel was low, oxygen supply ticked toward reserve. The aircraft's skin bore a constellation of pockmarks from flak fragments. Still, she answered every touch. At 38,000 feet, he finally saw them clearly. 3 Me-262s diving down on the bombers. Their assault looked almost casual, arcs of cannon fire plunging into silver bombers that heaved and scattered. One jet pulled upward again, its wide wings gleaming under the sun. Perfect target geometry. Whisner broke hard left into a climbing turn, positioning above the bomber formation's upper edge. The scene below blurred into patterns of white contrails. He rolled out on the interceptor's line, squeezed the throttle for all it could give, and let the aircraft climb head-on toward the oncoming blur. Their closing speed exceeded 700 miles per hour, 4 football fields every second. The contrast was absurd. One machine powered by barely restrained pistons, the other by turbines that hissed like living metal. In the instant they crossed paths, Whisner fired, more by reflex than by reason. His tracers scythed through the jet's arc. The Me-262 flashed past, pieces rippling off its port nacelle as it rolled violently away. Its pilot, Oberfeldwebel Fritz Stahler, tried to nurse the crippled engine home toward Rechlin. He never made it. Witnesses saw a spiral of black smoke vanish behind forest north of Brandenburg. Whisner pulled out of the dive at 25,000 feet, chest heavy from G-forces. He could feel the pull of blood leaving his head, gray vision nibbling at the edges of sight. One deep breath of frigid oxygen brought the world back into sharp focus. The trembling instrument panel, the sun cutting through the canopy, the faint shimmer of coolant vapor trailing from wounded bombers. Across the radio came fragmented reports. 2 jets destroyed, one unconfirmed, multiple Mustangs damaged. German formation broken. The air battle disintegrated into isolated combats, stretching across 100 miles of sky. Below, Berlin burned through a dense screen of smoke. Allied bombers were already turning northwest, climbing for altitude to begin the homeward leg. That meant the escorts had one last duty: ensure no surviving Luftwaffe units harried the retreating formation. Whisner regrouped his remaining wingmen. "Red flight, form on me," and descended along the bomber corridor. He counted his fuel. Barely enough to reach the Dutch coast. Even so, when a final Me-262 emerged from the haze attempting to align for attack, he went after it again, chasing through the descending columns of smoke and flak. The jet rolled tight, trying to shake him, but the Mustang's tighter turning radius at lower speed trapped it. Whisner fired a short controlled burst. The right engine of the Me-262 coughed once, then tore itself apart. Flames erupted along the fuselage. The aircraft nosed down, trailing an orange ribbon that ended in the Brandenburg Woods. 3 jets, each engagement different, each decided within seconds. For the Luftwaffe, it was one more daylight defeat. For the 8th Air Force, it was statistical proof that the jet threat could be contained. At 11:40 a.m., the order finally crackled through. Mission complete. Disengage and return home. The sky began to empty. Dozens of silver fighters turned westward, diving toward thicker air that felt almost warm after hours in the stratosphere. Whisner eased the Merlin back to cruising power. His gloved hand rested on the throttle as vibration diminished to a gentle hum. The relief was physical. Shoulders loosened, pulse steadied. Around him, the remnants of his squadron followed in neat echelon, each scarred but functional. Below lay the smoldering fields of Brandenburg. German villagers later remembered the sight. One P-51 escorting a loose formation of bombers across the wreckage of high clouds, its blue nose flashing briefly in sunlight before fading west. Over the English Channel, the last of his fuel gauges trembled near empty. Whisner dropped his Mustang onto Bodney's runway in late afternoon light, canopy streaked with frozen oil, armor paint scorched from engine heat. Ground crews swarmed the plane, wide-eyed at the bullet holes peppering the fuselage. He climbed out stiff-jointed, unbuckled his parachute, and only then allowed the smallest smile. 3 Me-262s claimed in one day. The first pilot in the European theater to achieve that feat. It was not exaltation he felt, but the simple, profound astonishment of having made it back. In the mess hall that evening, engineers studied his gun camera film frame by frame. Vaporizing jet, disintegrating tail, streaks of light rising like welded sparks. Nothing about it looked possible. Yet the reality was there on celluloid. Proof that even as technology raced ahead, a determined pilot and a piston engine could still dictate the terms of combat. The men watching that flickering footage knew it marked a boundary. The jet age had arrived, but courage and mastery still decided the outcome. And the Mustang's impossible climb had written that truth across the sky over Berlin. The reports reached 8th Air Force intelligence the same evening. Typed in the cool language of bureaucracy, they barely hinted at reality. Captain William T Whisner. 3 jet aircraft destroyed. Berlin area. Mission number 190. A single line in a stack of paper that described one of the most improbable aerial combats of the war. Gun camera reels arrived next. Grainy monochrome sequences showing contrails, bursts, smoke spirals. Analysts slowing the footage frame by frame saw the impossible geometry. A jet's climb, a prop-driven Mustang pulling through vapor. The brief flicker of tracer impact. Secretariat officers at Fighter Command confirmed the kills after comparing German loss records. Cross-checked later against Jagdgeschwader 7 archives, the data aligned neatly. Allied engineers, watching that film days later, could only mutter disbelief. They had built the idea of jet superiority into their post-war plans. Yet here was a piston engine rewriting it in real time. On the ground in Germany, surviving German pilots returned to their hangars in silence. Their commanders filed reports outlining excessive Allied altitude coverage and unforeseen aggressive pursuit. It was a diplomatic description for humiliation. Der Spiegel decades later quoted a mechanic from Brandenburg who had watched one of the flaming jets tumble down. At first we thought it was a fuel line explosion. When we learned an American propeller fighter caused it, nobody believed it. The incident quickly became legend among U.S. fighter groups. Whisner's quiet demeanor amplified the story. He wasn't a boasting type. In the mess that evening, he spoke mainly about engine readings and ammunition expenditure, then left early to check his aircraft. The ground crew, cleaning shrapnel scars from the wings, told journalists weeks later, he treated her like a living partner, not a tool. They were right. Synergy between pilot and machine had saved them both. Strategically, the victory carried more than symbolic weight. For Allied command, it proved that Me-262 units, though technologically advanced, could be countered through tactics and patience rather than matched technology. Manuals quickly updated their emphasis. Attack jets in climb or descent, never in level chase. In briefings that month, instructors projected Whisner's gun camera stills as textbook examples. Those frames, grainy yet luminous, became part of the curriculum for every Mustang pilot across Europe. For the Luftwaffe, morale plummeted further. Its jet program had been Hitler's last promise of a war-winning miracle. But after Berlin, even miracles looked mortal. By late March, activity at Rechlin slowed to a trickle of missions flown more for evacuation than defense. Galland himself admitted post-war that the jet could never regain air superiority against the swarms of enemy fighters guarding every approach. Whisner's climb encapsulated that imbalance. Courage allied with numbers against dwindling faith. When the 352nd Fighter Group rotated back to Bodny in following weeks, pilots noticed sudden respect radiating from younger units. Men who had never met Whisner left notes on his Mustang's engine cowl. Scraps of paper, coffee rations, lucky trinkets. The blue nose turned into a talisman. Yet in private diaries, several aces wrote of disquiet. They knew the war was ending, and their profession was ending with it. The jet age would replace them as surely as they had replaced horse cavalry from an earlier generation. Whisner, while dutiful in depersonalized reports, understood this too. He had looked straight into the future's eyes at 38,000 feet and found, for one instant, it could still bleed. History's tables later measured the engagement as a footnote inside the immense machinery of total war. But for the men who witnessed the explosion of those 3 Me-262s, it was something more intimate, a moment when determination outweighed design. The following afternoon, as maintenance crews fitted new leading-edge panels on Moonbeam McSwine, distant thunder rolled from the North Sea. It was only weather, yet the same metallic timbre as flak. Even back home, skies still sounded like war. The paperwork closed with a typed commendation and one line handwritten across the margin. Outstanding airmanship. Instruct pilot to rest. In the weeks that followed, the Third Reich folded scene by scene, and the Luftwaffe that had once darkened Europe's skies dissolved into memory. But for the men of Bodny, combat missions still launched each dawn until command finally confirmed the inevitable. The German Air Force was no longer a coordinated threat. Whisner stayed on flight rotation through April, now often leading mixed squadrons that combined veterans and newcomers fresh from American training programs. Their sorties shifted from escort duties to armed reconnaissance, roaming deep into Germany to strike whatever moved on roads or tracks. These missions were no longer contests of skill so much as reminders of inevitability. Enemy columns scattered at the glint of sunlight on Mustang wings. Berlin fell by the end of April. When word reached the 352nd, the airfield remained calm. No shouting, no celebrations. Mechanics simply paused, listening to the hum of distant engines taper into wind. In Whisner's flight log, that day's entry contained 3 words: War concluded. Alive. His triple victory of 2nd March rippled through post-war analysis. Engineers at Wright Field dissected his P-51's metrics, examining stress data and cooling efficiency at extreme altitude. They concluded that the aircraft had operated 12% beyond rated performance, an outcome attributed to Whisner's delicate throttle control and the efficiency of the Merlin's supercharger even passed its design ceiling. It was a feat of both engineering and human intuition, closing history on the piston fighter's ultimate potential. Within months, the same engineers were test-flying captured Me-262s and plotting jet prototypes, F-80s, Vampires, Meteor variants. Pilots understood they were witnessing the species' shift of aviation. Those who survived Europe's chaos were about to tutor a generation that would never fight with propellers again. Whisner himself was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, his citation summarizing the Berlin combat as exhibiting extraordinary heroism in aerial flight beyond the call of duty. But decorations seemed secondary. Interviews decades later show his modest refrain. "I was doing my job. The engine deserves more credit than the man." That humility echoed through post-war air forces. Courage had become less about spectacle than about consistency. The Luftwaffe records for 2nd March 1945 list 12 Me-262s lost or written off, half to enemy action near Brandenburg. German engineers themselves later confirmed that most jets failed while accelerating through vulnerable power bands. Exactly the weakness Whisner had exploited. In essence, he had demonstrated the blueprint for counterjet tactics that would guide Allied doctrine until all-jet combat redefined the arena. For his peers, though, the deeper impact was psychological. They had seen that mastery of fundamentals could still outpace novelty. In a war increasingly ruled by machinery, resolve remained the decisive variable. As demobilization rolled through England, the 352nd Fighter Group packed up Bodney's huts and dispersal bays. One afternoon, as the last aircraft prepared to leave for shipping depots, ground crews repainted the faint scratches along Moonbeam McSwine's blue nose. Unlike so many tools of war, this one would not be scrapped immediately. It was earmarked for exhibition, an emblem of that climactic season when piston and jet met in the same sky. When the aircraft finally started its engine for the ferry flight, the sound drew everyone onto the tarmac. A deep, familiar rumble rolling between hangars, somehow both farewell and reassurance. Those listening understood that they were hearing not just a machine, but the echo of an entire era closing itself with dignity. The record books would file the impossible climb as a technical anomaly inside an inevitable victory. Yet for those who breathed the cold oxygen of that day, the memory carried weight beyond numbers, a lesson that machines may set limits, but men decide whether to believe them. And the next dawn over Norfolk arrived quiet, filled with the faint smell of burned fuel and spring rain, as if the sky itself were finally exhaling. History is rarely courteous enough to pause for its heroes. It keeps moving, changing, forgetting detail until only contour remains. Yet some moments, brief as a burst from a .50 caliber gun, bend the arc of what came after. Whisner's climb above Berlin was one of them. It was not the number of aircraft destroyed that mattered, nor the medal pinned later to his uniform. What lingered was the defiance written into the laws of motion themselves. A piston engine was not supposed to follow a jet into the stratosphere. A man was not supposed to trust instinct beyond equations. A generation was not supposed to outfly the machines that would soon replace them. Yet all of that happened in a quarter hour of blue sky and smoke. When engineers and historians later reconstructed that battle, they found no new trick of physics, only the old one: courage amplified by precision. For those who study warfare as machinery, that lesson remains subversive. In the space between statistics lies something unmeasurable: the human capacity to push past enough. The transition from propeller to jet mirrored a broader passage, humanity crossing from the visible to the abstract, from analog heroism to mechanized speed. Whisner's fight stood on that threshold, 1 foot in each age. In his climb, the piston's roar met the turbine's hiss, and for a fleeting instant, they shared the same sky. Today, the old airfields lie quiet, scattered with weeds and rusted tie-downs. Children bicycle over concrete that once shuddered beneath 1,500 horses of metal fury. Above those fields, jets still trace contrails so high they look painted on glass. The lineage is direct, though the sound has changed. Look upward on a clear morning. See the faint line of vapor, vanishing as fast as it forms. Every pilot since that day carries a fragment of the same stubborn equation. Altitude bought by nerve. Endurance held by restraint. The laws of flight did not change in 1945. Only our understanding of who could still master them did. And somewhere, in the quiet logic of the atmosphere, a blue-nosed ghost continues its steady climb into sunlight, proving that limits are only directions written in pencil.